Welcome everyone to ACSM's Brown Bag in Science. We're really excited to have Paddy Ekkekakis with us today to talk about pleasure, displeasure responses to exercise. Paddy is a longtime member of the college and a fellow. Paddy did his undergraduate work at the University of Athens. You can probably tell by his name, he is from Greece. He did his master's at Kansas State University, so we know he's sad because of the basketball loss over the weekend. He did his doctoral work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and now he's a professor of exercise psychology at Iowa State University. Paddy really has been the leader in this area for many, many years. He did the seminal work in the relationship between affect and exercise, and he remains the leader in this area. He's widely cited, he's got books, and he's served on editorial boards and done all sorts of things. You've probably even seen some of his quotes in the lay press. So we're super excited to have Paddy with us today. We're gonna let Paddy talk for half an hour or so and tell us about his research, and then we'll have questions at the end. We have ACSM staff here in the Indianapolis office, and we also have lots of folks joining us remotely. So if you're not here with us, just type any questions you have for Paddy into the question area, and we will field those at the end. So Paddy, thank you so much for being with us today, and you can take it away.
Thank you, Lynette. I hope that the audio is okay and you can see my slides. Let me first of all express my sincere thanks and appreciation to the ACSM for this wonderful opportunity, and to Dr. Lynette Kraft in particular for the invitation. So as Dr. Kraft said, we're going to spend about 30 minutes or so giving you a very simple and easy to understand, I hope, overview of this area of research, and then I hope that we will have sufficient time to have some questions and answers afterwards. So let me start from the beginning. This is how my initial interest in this area began approximately 30 years ago. So as a student of exercise science, reading the literature that had started to emerge, the first systematic investigations in exercise psychology about 30 years ago, the literature seemed to suggest in a very consistent and clear way that exercise has one effect only on how people feel, and that is that it makes people feel better. And my initial reaction, as I think is the reaction of most people who are exercise science professionals, was pride. I was proud to tell everyone that the thing that I'm working on, called exercise, makes people feel better. But over time, I have to say, I started having questions. And I'm going to let you absorb the imagery here for a second. But what I'm trying to say is, well, if exercise makes people feel better, and that is the only effect that exercise has, then how come we don't have more people who are active and want to exercise? Because if you distance yourself from the fact that we're all passionate about exercise for a second, it should strike you that other things that make people feel better, people want to do all the time, and it's hard to stop them. So that was the beginning of my journey. And then along the way, you know, I started observing, I started looking around, and it's not hard to see that in society, exercise is really not portrayed as that thing that makes everyone feel better. And in fact, there are many indications that exercise, in fact, is perceived as something that is tiring or boring or exhausting or painful or other things. So about 10 years or so ago, I was in the UK giving a series of talks. And one of their fundraising foundations, called the British Heart Foundation for Heart Research, was launching a new campaign, fundraising campaign. And as part of that, they did a lot of press where they presented an update of their survey, which is done periodically around the UK. And they're asking people a variety of questions about exercise. So question number one, what percentage of people in the UK said that they would not exercise even if their life depended on it. And I would imagine that this number should surprise you as it surprised me. 62% said, no, I wouldn't exercise even if I knew that my life depended on it. Next question, what percentage of people in the UK find exercise fun? And you're probably now clued in that that should probably be low, but I don't know how many of you would have guessed 4%. So I was very curious. I went and I looked at the actual questions and how they were phrased, and they were phrased exactly as you see them here in a very straightforward manner. So without giving you all the gory details, I decided that we're going to start over and we're going to critically re-examine the way that we do this kind of research. And we started from scratch. So without trying to scare you, I'm going to give you a very simple overview of exercise physiology in about a minute or so. So the graph that you're looking at here is the relationship between oxygen uptake on the horizontal axis and then carbon dioxide excretion on the y-axis. And as you can see in the very beginning, this relationship is 1-to-1. As much oxygen as you consume, that much carbon dioxide comes out. So to make this very practical, this would be, for example, a walk for most healthy people who don't have any exercise limitations. A walk that you can continue without feeling any sense of exhaustion. And during the walk, you can carry out a conversation without panting and without gasping and without having to stop. After a certain point, and we're going to call that the VT or ventilatory threshold, after that point, the relationship changes, as you can see here. And now you start excreting or breathing out more carbon dioxide than the oxygen that you consume. So to make it practical again, this would be the point at which now your attention is turned inward. You kind of have to focus on your exercise. Your breathing changes, and exercise begins to be a bit of a challenge to continue. It's not exhausting. It's not overwhelming yet. But you kind of have to focus to keep going. So we're going to call the maximum point of that range the RCP, or respiratory compensation point. And then beyond that point, the last range from RCP to a person's maximal capacity, that's where you can see the end. You can feel that you probably have another minute of struggle in you, but that's about it. So you're clearly focusing on exercise. It begins to feel like it's overpowering you, and you feel like you will have to stop very, very soon. And indeed, after a while, you absolutely have to and must stop. So the first range, where you can carry on, a casual walk without much challenge, let's call that the moderate range of intensity. When the challenge begins, but it's not yet overwhelming, and you can continue even though your breathing has changed and it's a bit of a struggle, let's call that the heavy intensity. And then the last range at the end, where you feel that you just have maybe a minute or two left because you max out and you must absolutely stop, let's call that the severe intensity. So I hope that was understandable. Now, how do we measure pleasure and displeasure responses during exercise? Well, there's no physiological marker to do this. Pleasure and displeasure are quintessentially subjective states. So we have to use self-reports. And in order to not be obtrusive, we have to use a very short, very brief, simple scale that people can actually fill out during exercise without much hassle. So we call this the feeling scale, very simple. +5 is I feel very good, -5 is I feel very bad. Most people in Western societies, when you ask them how do you feel at rest, they would start from a +3. And then if they feel better, they will maybe tell you a +4 or a +5. And if they start feeling worse for some reason, they will start sliding down the scale to +2 and then +1. And in some cases, even start giving you negative responses. So let's go back then to this system of organizing exercise intensity that I showed you before. Now, if you think about it, in a sense of a hunter and gatherer society, where people actually had to be physically active for many, many hours per day, most of that, if not all of that, was within the moderate range, because people had to walk or hike for very long distances for many, many hours. So the only way to do that is to be physically active, be up on your feet, but the intensity was relatively manageable most of the time. So perhaps evolution gave us an incentive to promote, to encourage that type of activity that was absolutely essential for our survival. So on the right here, the lines that you see, each line represents at least one individual from a study when they were asked to walk at a self-selected pace, and most of them, in fact, chose to walk within the moderate range of intensity. If you count the lines, you will find out that 80% of the lines either go up, indicating that people felt better during the walk, or were positive, see the +2s and the +3s and the +4s and the +5s, were positive and just stayed positive. So at that range of intensity, the most common response is a response of pleasure. If you step on the gas and try to challenge yourself a little bit, and you go into the heavy domain of intensity. So now, again, remember, your breathing has changed and you have to focus on your exercise, and it's a bit of a challenge. Look at what happens. If you count the lines, about 45% of individuals feel better, about 45% of individuals feel worse, and you have about a 10% of individuals that continue feeling the same. So what we see here is a lot of variability, a lot of individual differences from one person to the other. And you can probably think about people you know, including yourself. Some, when exercise starts to become a challenge, they like that, and they thrive on it. And that's in fact what they like about exercise. It's that sense of being challenged, but also being able to do it. And then at the same time, there are other people that when exercise starts to become a challenge, they feel worse and they try to avoid it. If we go one step higher, it's perhaps unsurprising that most of the lines that you see go down. If you take somebody close to their maximal exercise capacity, when the exercise becomes absolutely a very intense and powerful challenge, then you will see that most individuals feel worse. So to summarize, you can think of the relationship between exercise intensity and pleasure displeasure in these terms. So imagine that this is individual A. Individual A feels good during the moderate range of intensity, that casual self-paced walk. But then as soon as they exceed their ventilatory threshold and they get into the heavy intensity, they start feeling worse and worse. This would be individual B. Individual B feels good during the moderate range of intensity, continues feeling good during the heavy range of intensity, but then starts to feel worse during the severe range of intensity. So you can think of this relationship in terms of a zone or a region of homogeneity in the beginning when intensity is relatively low and manageable, with the main response here being pleasure. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, there's again response homogeneity. Most individuals feel the same, but in this case, it's displeasure. And then somewhere in the middle, we have a zone of response variability with some individuals feeling better and some individuals feeling worse. Now, when you consider that for a second, then you might think to yourself, okay, then the solution is to just ensure that people exercise within the moderate range of intensity. And that sounds simple, but it has become more complicated than you think. So I'm going to give you an example of an actual individual from one of our studies. So these are data from an actual real woman that was tested here, 41 years of age, body mass index that put her on the cusp between being normal weight and overweight. So this was not an obese individual, but she was chronically sedentary, had not been physically active for several years, and was otherwise healthy. So we require that people have a paper from their physician saying that they are free of disease and therefore vigorous exercise is not going to pose any risk. So just to do a little bit of calculations here for the people joining us who might understand what these numbers mean. So this particular individual had a shockingly low oxygen uptake, so very low level of cardiorespiratory fitness of 17 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And her ventilatory threshold was at 60% of that. So that would be 10 ml per kg per minute. So that translates to about 2.85 METs. So activities of 2.85 METs would place that individual above their ventilatory threshold and presumably make that individual feel worse. So let's translate that into terms that most people can understand. So these examples here show activities that are less than 2.5 MET. So these would be examples of things that, in the case of this particular individual, would be below her ventilatory threshold. So moving about indoors, say while preparing a meal, people chop carrots over here and then they put the carrots in the soup over there. So that type of movement in the house, walking slowly without carrying anything, mild stretching, fishing from a seated position, light dusting. So these would be below ventilatory threshold. These are examples of activities that would put that particular individual above ventilatory threshold and therefore presumably make that individual feel worse. Slow walking, say coming back from the store and carrying a couple of bags with groceries, waltzing, fishing but from a standing position, cleaning windows and therefore moving your arms around, sweeping or mopping the floor. So imagine if you're an exercise professional, then how hard it is to find exercise options that would make that particular individual stay within the moderate range of intensity below ventilatory threshold and therefore presumably feel good. I think that most exercise professionals would probably encourage their clients to do something more than this, more intense than this, right? Because none of these looks like, quote, real exercise. So that's where I think the problem lies. To take this a step further, imagine that you begin a program of exercise and it does feel bad. You feel tired, you feel exhausted, you feel muscle pain, and it's not fun. So you go to your exercise professional and you complain. So at this point, most exercise professionals are told to do the following three things. Tell their clients, don't focus your attention on it, focus on something else. That's why all of the gyms everywhere have music, loud music, and television screens. In psychological terms, we call that attentional dissociation. Distract your attention. Don't focus on the pain and suffering that exercise induces. Just try to focus on something more pleasant. Number two, think of it as something positive. It's your body's way of telling you that it's getting stronger. This is pretty common, to try and portray the discomfort, the pain of exercise as a good thing, as an indication that you're doing the right thing, that your body is responding to the exercise and getting stronger. In psychological terms, we call that cognitive reframing or reappraisal or reinterpretation. And the last thing is telling people, oh, just believe in yourself. Essentially push through the discomfort, push through the pain, believe that you can do it. In psychological terms, we call that bolstering someone's sense of self-efficacy. So these are the main methods that we currently have to try and change that discomfort or displeasure of new exercisers, minimize it, attenuate it, and therefore encourage them to stay with an exercise program. Well, let's think about that for a second. So what we believe is driving the pleasure-displeasure responses to exercise are two things. Going back to our original system with the 3 domains of intensity, we believe that one contributing factor is how the body is responding. So all the messages, all the symptoms that the body is sending, telling your conscious awareness that this is difficult and this poses a potential challenge or a potential risk. So let's call these interoceptive factors. Their influence is low in the moderate intensity. It begins to grow in the heavy intensity, and then it becomes really the focal point, very influential in the severe intensity. The second factor that influences how you feel is what we call cognitive factors. For example, your self-confidence, the belief that you can do it, or from the negative side, concerns and worries about being negatively evaluated by others, that type of thing, thoughts, in other words. And as you will see, thoughts are important in the moderate intensity to some extent. They become super duper important in the heavy intensity when there is a challenge and it needs to be managed. And then their influence actually is minimized in the severe intensity. So how you think about your exercise and how confident you are, for example, that's not very important when you're exercising at close to 100% of your capacity. It's not going to help if I try to teach you at that point to think of exercise as something positive or to focus on something else. Now, why does this happen? Not to be too technical, but there was always a challenge to try and understand how the brain reacts during exercise. In the last few years, a new technique is being used called near-infrared spectroscopy. Most people shouldn't care about what this means, but what is important to understand is this. So this is on the horizontal axis is the range of exercise intensity. And what you will see with this graph is the degree of activation of the prefrontal cortex, which helps people do those cognitive techniques, you know, the dissociation or the reframing that I mentioned earlier. Look at what happens, however, as people approach the end and go into the severe domain of intensity. The prefrontal cortex actually shuts down. It receives less oxygenated blood at that level of intensity than it did at rest. And therefore, because of these techniques rely on a supply of oxygenated blood to keep the prefrontal cortex active, that supply of oxygenated blood is not there at severe intensity. So even if you tell somebody, try to reinterpret what the exercise means, or the fact that, you know, it's pain, but perhaps it's good pain, those things are not going to be effective because the prefrontal cortex is not receiving a sufficient amount of blood at that point. Now, moving on as to what all of this means for your future exercise behavior. So far in exercise psychology, we are focusing on certain theories. These theories have been around for several decades. None of them were developed with exercise specifically in mind, but researchers thought that perhaps they're relevant to exercise behavior, and they have been used. I'm not going to dwell on what these theories say, but I'm going to tell you that all of these theories rely on a certain assumption, and the assumption is that the way that people make decisions to start an exercise program or stay in an exercise program is by evaluating information. In other words, I'm going to start exercising if you convince me that that is good for me, that I have things to gain, or I have more things to gain than things to lose. So all of the theories that we have been using for decades rely on what we call an assumption of rationality, that human beings take in all of the necessary information, analyze it in a very logical, rational way, and that's how they make decisions, including decisions about exercise. Well, let me present you with some information. The study at the top showed that 97% of American adults consider physical inactivity a health risk factor, which is not surprising, right? Because we hear so many messages, and those messages resonate with people. I think that most Americans understand that they need to be more physically active. The study at the bottom was an investigation of how many Americans are actually physically active at a minimum level. 97% fail to do the minimum recommended amount of physical activity. So think about that contrast. 97% are convinced that exercise would benefit their health. 97% do not do sufficient physical activity to benefit their health. So that should be a good indication that perhaps that assumption of rationality maybe is not telling us the whole truth. So this has now, or is becoming, more and more understood. This is from a series of articles that were published before the London Olympics in 2012. And this is one interesting quote. The traditional public health approach based on evidence and exhortation, in other words, our standard method of trying to convince people to be active by telling them about all the wonderful benefits that exercise will bring, to some extent has been unsuccessful so far. So it hasn't been working. Let's come to ACSM for a second. So ACSM is known the world over primarily for the ACSM guidelines for exercise testing and prescription. And a couple of editions of that book ago, there was a statement in there that clearly lays out how the guidelines are developed. What are the guiding principles? So the ACSM is trying to develop guidelines for exercise testing and prescription that, number one, maximize the health benefit for as many people as possible. And number two, minimize the potential risk from exercise for as many people as possible. So I'm going to let you think about that for a second. So if I have public health guidelines that are guaranteed to give you the maximum benefit and guaranteed to give you the minimum risk, am I done? Is that it? So I call this the two-legged stool. And the reason is that none of this really will matter at the end unless people are willing to do the exercise. They will never get the optimal benefit unless they're willing to actually engage in the behavior. So a turning point for people who engage in the type of research that I have been describing was the 9th edition of the ACSM guidelines, where for the first time there was a mention of pleasure and the necessity to try and maintain a level of pleasure during exercise that will then encourage people to come back and continue being physically active. Now, sadly, as a parenthesis, all of that disappeared in the 10th edition that came out a few months ago. But I remain optimistic that we will continue trying to explain what pleasure is all about and the importance of pleasure, so that hopefully pleasure will return in the next edition. This is from the quantity and quality of exercise position stand. So again, you will see statements like exercise that is pleasant and enjoyable can improve adoption and adherence to prescribed exercise programs. So we have been able to influence the way that our field of research and the ACSM think about exercise prescriptions to some extent. Now, in terms of proposing new directions for how we understand, how we predict, and how we change exercise behavior, in the last few years, researchers have come to think of the mind as consisting of two parts. There's a system one, the older parts of the mind that tend to work on some automatic, instinctive, reflex-like drives or tendencies that depend to a very large extent on previous pleasure and displeasure experiences with various behavioral options. And then we have what we call system two, which is the newer mind, the most sophisticated, more developed mind that in fact works the way that our current theories would expect, which is we take in information, we rationally analyze it, and we make very logical and evidence-based decisions. To give you an example, this would be a poster by the American Heart Association trying to promote heart health that focuses entirely on system two. It provides people with a lot of information in an appealing format. And the assumption is that if you're an adult and you perhaps are beginning to consider your future and your health, you will be interested, you will read the information, you will retain the information, and then you will make appropriate decisions on the basis of that information. This is an example of a poster that was designed to appeal entirely to system one. So no information, no data, no numbers, no figures. Instead, what it is trying to do is give you a visual that is presumably appealing for most people, and then through repetition, get you to associate that appealing visual and all the sensations that follow that visual with a particular brand. So after many, many, many years, decades, now you begin to see the American Heart Association moving in the same direction that the tobacco industry had started to follow decades ago, right? So this is a recent poster by the American Heart Association. Notice that there is no information, no data, no figures, no words, in fact. And the only thing that the poster is trying to do, again through repetition, is to get you to associate physical activity with smiling faces or family time or pleasure in general. So that's now the conversation within exercise psychology. I think for the first time we're beginning to realize that we have pushed the informational campaigns to their maximum without getting any benefits, any changes in physical activity participation. So what remains now is to look at the system one approaches, because it turns out that most adults, not just in the US, but in most countries, associate or have come to associate exercise with displeasure, discomfort, boredom, injury, or who knows what else. So we have now recently proposed a new theory that expands our perspective and incorporates not just the type 2 kind of approaches that we have been using for a long time, but also tries to get people to think, how can we improve the system 1, type 1 perspective? In other words, how can we get people to associate exercise and physical activity with pleasure and happiness and enjoyment? So to move forward a little bit and save some time, so here's an example of what we think is happening with the vast majority of adults in Western countries. So most people have let a lot of years go by without physical activity, perhaps trying to launch a business or enhance their careers or raise a family. And the result of that has been reduced fitness and excess body mass. And maybe at some point, they make the decision, a New Year's resolution perhaps, to start an exercise program. So their body has changed, it has become weaker, their self-perceptions have changed, and at some point, they make an exercise attempt. Because they push themselves, and most people tend to push themselves or are being pushed by exercise professionals, they go to exercise once and they derive displeasurable experiences or unpleasurable experiences. They try it a second time or a third time or a fourth time with the same results. And then what happens is what we call affective valuation, meaning that a minus sign is attached to the idea of exercise. And then every time the idea of should I go out for a walk or should I go out to exercise, every time that idea comes to people's heads, it comes with that minus sign attached to the notion. So that tends to discourage them from making any future exercise attempts. So to close, think about this. This is how kids come into the world. I call this the factory setting. The factory setting is they run around all the time with huge smiles on their faces. It's hard to keep up with them. They seem to enjoy movement. And then what do? Here's an example of what we do. We have a very regimented, very strict, very focused on fitness and obesity prevention, physical education, with, I think, a lot of dysfunctional aspects or dysfunctional elements. And we have evidence coming out showing that even years or decades after physical education, most people have traumatic memories of physical education. So that's strike one. Strike two is youth sport, which is also dysfunctional in a variety of different ways. And we have tremendous evidence showing the dropout from organized youth sport is driven primarily by the fact that the kids are not getting the main reason why they got into youth sport in the first place, which is to have fun. The number one reason for dropout is I'm not having fun. That's strike two. And then you get to adulthood and you have this association between exercise and punishment for eating too much. And that's strike three. So if you think about it, it's almost as if our society has been trying to associate the notion of exercise with a minus sign, with experiences or memories of displeasure. So that's all I had. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that it was, no pun intended, a pleasant and enjoyable experience, and I would be more than happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Paddy. That was great. We're going to take some questions at this time. If anybody here in the room has a question, I'm going to have you come over here to this mic. And it looks like we have some questions coming in remotely. So we have a question from Nicholas. He says, I work for a law enforcement agency and I am a fitness instructor for my agency. How can I promote the importance of fitness among the officers?
It's actually quite a difficult question because the focus there is fitness in a profession in which fitness is absolutely paramount. What I have been discussing was not fitness. What I've been discussing was exercise and physical activity for health promotion. And health promotion does not necessarily go hand in hand with fitness enhancement. Nevertheless, I think that the fundamental point that I try to make still applies to some extent. If exercise or physical activity become paired with the notion of displeasure, discomfort, guilt, embarrassment, pain, it is a natural human tendency to avoid those activities in the future. So I understand that a law enforcement person needs to be pushed, because unless they are pushed, fitness will not improve, right? And what you really need for that particular profession is fitness enhancement. However, I would try and exhaust all possibilities in coming up with ways to promote fitness. In other words, to have high intensity, challenging exercise that does not take away the element of pleasure and enjoyment. Otherwise, when the law enforcement officers are left to their own devices and they have to follow the fitness regimen on their own without supervision or coercion, they will not do it. So you have to investigate what that might be. It could be social activities. It could be an element of play incorporated in those activities. It could be a playful sort of challenge incorporated in those activities. But unless people leave the training with a sense that that was fun, they will not continue. That's the problem.
Great. Thank you, Patty. We have another person asked about whether you saw any changes in affective response if the exercise was done in a group or in a social setting as compared to done alone.
That's an excellent question. So there has been some research on that, and I have to say the social environment cuts both ways. The social environment can promote positive affective responses, but it can also undermine affective responses. So it can promote positive affective responses when you have positive social interactions, when you have an elimination of even the perception of critical evaluation by the others. People need to feel comfortable within the social environment of exercise. And that involves, in many cases, an elimination of the possibility for social comparisons. So, for example, if you get an individual with what we call self-presentational concerns, people who are self-conscious about their body and the appearance, the shape, the proportions, or the fitness of their body, and you put them in an environment surrounded by young and healthy and fit and athletic people, that will undermine affective responses, right? So unfortunately, that idea has not resonated with the fitness industry very much. The fitness industry supposedly tries to be inclusive and welcoming to the masses of American adults, but the masses of American adults are sedentary, they're overweight, and they're not particularly physically fit. But if you visit a fitness facility, you will find an environment that is essentially a living nightmare. It's wall-to-wall mirrors that indicate a critical evaluation of the physique. It's people scantily clad, most of them, the vast majority, young and healthy and athletic. So that type of environment, in fact, undermines affective responses. So you got to be careful. If the social environment is positive, yes, it promotes pleasure and enjoyment. But if the social environment has all the things that we have become accustomed to, mirrors and social comparisons and social evaluations, that can actually have detrimental effects.
Oh, hey, Patty, this is Caitlin from the ACSM office, and I've actually taught fitness classes, group fitness classes, for several years. And there have been several times when I have seen people who are coming into a fitness class, and you can tell have probably been fairly sedentary leading up to coming to a fitness class. You know, they're definitely not able to keep up as well as some other people, and you can see that they're pushing themselves beyond that level of comfort because they're trying to keep up with other people. What would be your advice to fitness professionals who are trying to keep their clients, members of their class, their personal training clients, within that pleasurable range personally for themselves without pushing themselves too far, whether they think it's peer pressure or whether they feel like that's what they have to do, if you want to keep them engaged?
Yeah, excellent question. So it's common practice, even though I think most people, if they think about it, will find it irrational. It's common practice to blend the newbies with the more seasoned exercisers, right? You put them in the back of the room, you say, keep up as best as you can. But what ends up happening is that social pressure to keep up with the group, if you're a new exerciser, and there are data about this, you see them working out at 95% of their capacity. Well, take any healthy, fit, young individual and push them to their 95% and then see how they feel. Right? 95%, as I showed you, if you get close to your maximal capacity, everyone unanimously feels worse. So I would strongly encourage new beginners, especially after long periods of inactivity, to consider physical activity, not exercise programs. So something that they can do by themselves or something that they can do with their family, but don't put yourself in the middle of a high impact, high intensity exercise class with seasoned exercisers who have been exercising at those high intensities for many years, because that's a recipe for disaster. If you choose to go to an exercise professional, make sure that you go to an exercise professional who understands these basic mechanisms, and therefore will try to focus on you on an individual basis and keep the intensity within those manageable levels in the beginning, at least until you build a foundation of fitness and you can start challenging yourself. But we lose a lot of people in those critical early stages. They come in, they are thrown in with the rest of the group, they cannot keep up, and guess what happens next?
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. I had a question. So in that sort of moderate range where you talked about some of the cognitive strategies that we typically encourage people to try, like dissociation or enhancing their efficacy, maybe aren't entirely successful, particularly for somebody who's sedentary, deconditioned, and is experiencing, fair amounts of discomfort, even in a moderate zone. What about something like distress tolerance training? I mean, if we trained people to, enhance their level of distress tolerance prior to starting an exercise program, do you think that would be effective at all?
So I'm not very familiar with distress tolerance training, I must say. I want to clarify what I said. Do these techniques work? Yes, they do work, but they work as long as you maintain intensity within the moderate and maybe the lower bounds of the heavy range of intensity. When you first begin to feel a challenge and you first have, the need to push a little bit. They do not work when intensity is approaching maximal capacity. So you're going to have to excuse my ignorance, but I don't know how distress tolerance training would be different, to the extent that it also relies on prefrontal cortical mechanisms. I think our data are showing that people simply don't have the biological capacity to engage executive processing, meaning cognitive mechanisms, at a very, very high level of intensity. So to me, all of these techniques show promise. They work to attenuate the sense of discomfort and displeasure under one condition, and the condition is intensity has not been pushed to the max.
Yeah, thanks. I think you're spot on with that. Here's a question we have from Gabriel. He says that he works with patients with peripheral artery disease. So the recommendation for those patients is to walk at moderate levels of pain. And so he's wondering, how do you increase pleasure of exercise for those types of patients, or for other patients who, are experiencing chronic pain, and pain is sort of the point at which exercise level is set?
That's an excellent question, and you know, my gut reaction to that question is, oh, I wish I had, you know, a better answer. So patients with PAD, all of them have a range of tolerance, meaning a range at which they can move before the first onset of pain. The problem is that in more severe cases, that range of tolerance is very short, meaning that they can walk in some cases 100 meters or 200 meters and then pain starts. So then professionals have decided that even, you know, as long as the pain is tolerable, meaning it's present, but you can still push through it, then you should push through it. That's where I think we have a short range to play with. Instead of trying to get them to stop at maximum pain, which is what now happens, you can get them to stop and take a break at difficult to manage pain, not unmanageable, but when it becomes really hard to continue. Not impossible to continue, but hard to continue. So in this case, you don't really enhance pleasure, but at least to try to minimize or reduce the displeasure. I'm very sorry to say that in a person with PAD, to have hopes to create truly, honestly pleasurable exercise experiences, that is difficult. But at least I would hope that the exercise professionals out there don't try to communicate the message push, 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 push until, you know, the very end, when it's truly unbearable anymore. I think push, push, yes, to some extent, but let's try to encourage them to stop when it becomes difficult, not impossible. I'm sorry that I don't have a better message, but PAD is a really challenging condition for exercise professionals.
Yeah. Paddy, I know you've been somewhat outspoken around the issue of HIIT, and you know, there's been a lot of attention to HIIT, and you know, promoting the fact that people can get in a much shorter workout and get the health benefits if they just work really, really hard. And of course, you know, you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of variation in what people find enjoyable. Can you just speak to this idea that, you know, we're promoting HIIT as a way to get your minutes of exercise in a more efficient manner, but that it may or may not be appropriate for everyone?
So thank you for asking the most inflammatory and controversial question possible. I'll get you for it.
It's okay. We are recording you.
So to me, the HIIT experience was a very disconcerting sign of I'm going to use the word disintegration of the unity or the coherence of our field, because we didn't come out with a HIIT message as a public health strategy after an internal debate within the field, so that the psychologists would have an opportunity to perhaps present a different perspective on things. HIIT was promoted on an individual basis by some of us without an opportunity for an internal debate. We seem to have gone to the TV stations or to the New York Times directly without having discussed first how we should frame things, what cautionary notes we should emphasize, and all of those kinds of things. So, are there people who enjoy HIIT? Yes, absolutely. Should those people be prescribed less intense exercise? No. If they enjoy HIIT, they should go for it. If they go home and in their mind what they just did was superb, they should by all means continue doing HIIT. At the same time, you got to study the national statistics. And the national statistics indicate that 0.0 something percent of individuals are regularly active at a vigorous level. Forget maximum level, we're talking just vigorous level. So to come out as a public health message and say what you have been told all these years to be physically active for 30 minutes or 60 minutes is complete and total nonsense and a waste of time. And the real secret, the real way to do it is to do these high intensity short bursts. I think that that was a public relations disaster, because it communicated a very confusing and I would claim non-evidence-based message to the public. I'm very sorry to say that as a field in general, our public communication strategy has been bad to begin with, and I'm afraid that the high intensity interval training campaign has made the situation worse. For the vast majority of the people who are struggling with the decision to get off the couch and just start incorporating more physical activity in their lives, the notion that they need to do, or it would be more clever, more efficient to do high intensity short bursts, I think that that just raised the confusion unnecessarily and set us back.
Great, thank you. We're going to have one more question. What about, so there used to be some thinking that if you ended the exercise bout in a pleasurable frame of mind, or you manipulated the bout towards the end such that it was perceived as pleasurable, then it would be remembered as pleasurable overall, and folks would be more likely to do it again. Is that line of thought still in existence, or are there things you can do to manipulate the perception of the overall experience?
Right. So we are, please understand, we're now only beginning the process of trying to figure out how those things work. So for example, initially, we thought that it's the average pleasure during an entire session that will determine whether you remember the session as pleasant or unpleasant. And it turns out that it's not quite as simple as that there are some tricks, some secrets that we didn't quite understand. And we look at a different field of research called behavioral economics for some insights, because they have been there and they have been investigating these types of questions well before us, decades before us. So it appears that your total pleasure doesn't matter, that your average pleasure doesn't matter, how long a pleasant or unpleasant episode lasted doesn't matter. What appears to matter the most are three things. Number one, the pleasure or displeasure at the end of the experience. So we're exercise people, so for us that primarily means sort of a low intensity, pleasant cool down at the end. Number two, the highest level of pleasure or the worst displeasure felt during the experience. And number three, whether, if you look at the pattern of pleasure and displeasure change over time, whether the experience was becoming increasingly more unpleasant, which is how we now typically structure our exercise programs. We start low and then we raise the intensity until people cannot pretty much take it anymore, right? Or this was an experience in which the level of pleasure increased over time. So perhaps we started out, and I know that this sounds very counterintuitive, perhaps we started out with the worst part, the most challenging, the most difficult part, but then for the rest of the time, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, we scale back the intensity gradually so that the pattern of pleasure, displeasure that is generated is one where the experience gets better and better over time, feels better and better over time. So these are perhaps the three most influential parts: the pleasure displeasure at the end, the best pleasure or the worst displeasure at any point during the experience, and whether the pattern of pleasure displeasure was one where the pleasure increased gradually or the pleasure decreased gradually. These three things appear to influence how the experience then is remembered, how it is registered in our memory. And then 2 days later, 3 days later, when perhaps the idea of exercise pops back into our minds, that memory, the way that we remember our last session, that will influence our gut reaction and will either propel us forward and make us get up off the couch and go and work out, or keep us tethered to the couch.
All right. Thank you, Paddy. With that, I think we're out of time. We want to thank Paddy for his time today and a great presentation. Thank you, everyone who joined us remotely. We're thrilled to have you and appreciate your time and your questions. So with that, we will end the webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.